Welcome to Roll for Geekiness and another episode of the Deck Brewers Cauldron. I'm Jonathan, and today, rather than talk about one of my favorite decks and the cards and combos that make it tick, I'm going to be talking about something that makes all of our decks tick: lands. I think that there's a time in all of our deck building journeys when we realize that we can have all of the best cards in our decks, but it doesn't matter if we don't have a proper mana base to cast them. It doesn't help that even Wizards of the Coast hasn't done a great job of modeling for us what a good mana base could or should look like. Most of their pre-constructed commander decks have mana bases that are, let's be honest, mediocre at best, and this has only just begun to shift towards something a little better since the 2024 decks. For the most part, they've reprinted the same cycles of moderately decent to just plain bad lands and expected us to make the best of it. Many of the best lands are only reprinted in premium sets or collector boosters, or are just long out of print. But before I start talking about best, I have to provide some context, because rarely is anything simply the best, unless you're referring to our YouTube channel. If you've watched any of our other Magic the Gathering content, then you know that while many of us dabble in a few game formats, we all play Commander. For me, it's what I play the most and think about the most. So I'll be talking about all of these lands in the context of Commander. But since Commander is an eternal format, that does mean that I'll be talking about lands from the entire history of the game. So there will certainly be some applicability to other formats. The biggest difference may be that Commander is, usually, a 3 to 5 player format. So some things that may work well in Commander may not work as well in 1v1 formats, or in formats where you start with less than 40 life. That said, I'm also not going to touch on the original duels. Volcanic Island, Bayou, Taiga, all the rest. They're going to check almost every box that would define best. And that's because they break a rule that WotC's R&D department later made for itself. No land can be strictly better than a basic land. Ever since the original duels, lands that produce 2 or more colors come into play tapped, or require you to meet certain conditions or pay some cost for them to come into play untapped. So, basics. Don't underrate them. They come into play and give you mana right away. It just gets difficult to figure out how many to include and how to balance them when we're running multicolor decks. The more colors, the more difficult this is. And that is why there is so much design space for multicolored lands. So because of those drawbacks, this conversation is going to assume that we're only dropping 1 land per turn, and we don't have any effects that will untap them if they enter tapped. Also, just to be clear, I'm not going to be talking about utility lands. By utility land, I mean a land that has an activated ability, that is not a mana ability, that you might use to further the function of your deck. Many times these only produce colorless mana, and we're including them because they're a free slot in the deck. I don't know that I would say that these really contribute to our mana base. Before we dive in, I also want to define a few terms that are going to come up, in case you haven't heard them before. The first is cycle. Besides being a keyword ability that lets you discard and draw cards, WotC uses this term to define a collection of cards that have a similar design but exist in all colors. Sometimes this relation is quite loose, but when we're talking about lands, they're all cards that function exactly the same but produce different combinations of mana. All of the guild gates, for example. The second is mana fixing. In the broadest sense, this is just making sure that you have access to the right colors of mana to cast your spells. Arguably, any source that taps for more than 1 color of mana is a form of fixing, but the end of that spectrum is something that can tap to produce any color of mana. The last thing that I think I'm going to say a lot is on curve. To play on curve would mean that I have 1 mana available to me on turn 1, 2 on turn 2, 3 on turn 3, etc., etc. It also means that I'm able to spend all of that mana each turn, but that's a topic for broader deck building. So, assuming that we want to play on curve, that immediately rules out every land that unconditionally comes into play tapped. None of these can ever qualify as best. And let's illustrate that real quick. Let's assume we have two decks that are going to hit their land drops for each of the first 3 turns. One will have all of their lands enter untapped, and the other will have all of their lands enter tapped. By turn 3, the first deck has 3 mana available and has produced up to 6 mana so far this game. The second deck has 2 available and has only been able to produce 3 so far this game. If we extend that to turn 5, the gap in how much they each have available doesn't look as stark. 5 mana versus 4 mana. But the difference in the amount that each has been able to produce so far is 15 versus 10, which can obviously be impactful. So, as you might guess, at this point, I don't run any lands that enter tapped unconditionally. Unless, maybe, they're going to do something else for me. Gain a life, scry 1, exile an opponent's graveyard. If it provides some other utility, sort of for 1 mana, then it might be worthwhile depending on your deck's strategy. Just be aware that this isn't really like paying 1 for this effect, because you will be behind the curve for the rest of the game. In casual, this might not matter, but in higher power level games with highly optimized decks, it will. Okay, we've established that tap lands aren't great, but we're not going to talk about the original duels, and basics are actually pretty good, and we should all probably run a few more of them. We do. So where does that leave us? Besides Command Tower, this leaves us in the huge zone of lands that may conditionally enter untapped. This includes the Battle Bond land cycle, the Filter Land and Odyssey Filter Land cycles, the Check Land and Reveal Land cycles, the Slow and Fast Land cycles, the Pain Land cycle, the Tango Lands, the Verge Land cycle, of course, the Fetch and Shock Land cycles, and the Pathway cycle. It also includes the Tainted Lands, though those are only applicable to decks with black, and some Kindred Lands, but those are only useful for playing those Kindreds. There is also the Incomplete Storage Lands, the Horizon Lands, and some Future Shifted Lands that are both incomplete and inconsistent in their effects. It also technically includes the Deplete Lands from Ice Age, the Slow Untap Lands from Tempest and Kamigawa, the Tri Lands from Homelands, and the Tri Layers, all of which come with notable drawbacks and are not full cycles. Let's take a deeper look at some of these. For Commander, the Battle Bond land cycle is a no-brainer. They enter untapped when you simply have more than one opponent, which pretty much defines the format. What more is there to say? The Filter Lands always tap for colorless, but you can also pay one of the 2 colors of the land to get 2 mana out in any combination of those colors. In other words, I can pay 1 black or 1 red to get 2 black, 2 red, or 1 black and 1 red. Compared to the Odyssey Filter Lands, which I'll talk about in a moment, these will always provide me with at least colorless mana, so I usually don't mind having them in a starting hand. And they can fix really well in a 2-color deck, because if I'm short 1 color, I can use these to transform 1 color entirely into the other or a combination, whatever I need. They might feel a little less useful in a 3+ color deck because I need to have one of the land's colors to generate anything other than colorless. That's where the Odyssey filters come in. Called Odyssey because that's when the cycle started, but they only just finished it in Fallout. For these, you pay one of any color to get out a combination of two. The obvious downside is that they don't produce any mana on their own. You need to have something to pay in. But this can be any color. So in 3+ color decks, I could pay, say, one white to get out one red and one black. So they're good for fixing. The other drawback is that they only produce a single color pair. So if I need 2 red to cast something, I'll need to find one of those somewhere else. Between the 2 filter land cycles, I prefer the first, but the second can certainly be useful. Then there's the check lands. These enter untapped as long as you control a land with either of the subtypes related to the colors it produces. i.e., if it taps for white or blue, you'll want to have an island or plains in play first. Note that this does not specify that land has to be a basic. However, in 2-color decks, we should be running enough basics that this is a low bar to jump, so this can usually come in untapped. In 3+ colors, that might get trickier. Similarly, there are the reveal lands. The criteria is similar, except that the related land has to be in your hand to reveal it, rather than already in play. I tend to not like these as much because I usually don't have a bunch of lands in hand by mid-game, and it's only going to come in untapped if I draw this early or I'm drawing a lot of cards in general. Then there's the slow lands. These come in untapped as long as you control 2 or more other lands. So by turn 3, these should always be coming in untapped. And who keeps a 2-land hand? There are very few cases where these are bad. Alternately, there's the fast land cycle. As you might expect, they are the opposite of the slow lands. They'll come in untapped as long as you have 2 or fewer lands. These are great if you find them in your starting hand, but after that they are a liability, so I really don't like them as much. Similar to the slow lands are the tango lands. These enter untapped as long as you control 2 or more basics. And again, we're all running enough basics, right? I run these a lot. Then we have the pain lands. These will always tap for colorless, but if we want one of either of these lands' 2 associated colors, we take 1 damage. In 40 life formats like Commander, this is typically a small price to pay, and by mid-game we can probably just use it for colorless to meet the generic costs on larger spells. Similar to the pain lands are the horizon lands. For these, we will always pay 1 life to get 1 mana from them, but we can eventually sacrifice them for card draw. Interestingly, this cycle is missing 4 cards, which is a little odd. Usually we get half a cycle if we don't get a full one. As long as we're paying life, there's the fetch land cycle that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Pay 1 life and sacrifice it to search for a subtype of either of the land's associated colors. Notably, this does not need to be a basic. I really like putting these in 4+ color decks because they can always find the tri-cycle lands to help me hit all of my colors. And in the same vein, there's the shock lands that, again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Simply pay 2 life to have these enter untapped. Again, in 40 life formats, this is a small price to pay. Moving on, we have the pathway cycle. These can enter as either of 2 colors depending on which side you play. Unfortunately, once played, you've locked in what color it's going to be for the rest of the game, unless you intend to remove it and replay it somehow. I think these are most useful in 3+ color decks where making sure you have all of your colors available is key. But most of the time, I prefer a land that has flexibility from turn to turn. As we wrap up, we have the Verge lands. We got this new cycle between Duskmourn and Aetherdrift. Each will tap for 1 color of mana until you control a land with the subtype associated with either of its colors. For example, it taps for white, but if you have a plains or island, it can also tap for blue. Again, these don't need to be basics, so we can hit that requirement with a few things. I'm honestly still trying to wrap my head around these because even with that example I just gave, I wouldn't be able to get blue from it on turn 1, but I could get white. I think they certainly have a place in 2-color decks that aren't evenly balanced, as long as the unconditional color is the primary color of your deck. And we don't yet have a cycle that flips these color combos around. But again, if you're running enough basics to begin with, the condition should be pretty easy to meet. So, as an honorable mention, I include the Tainted lands. This incomplete cycle is only applicable to black. They tap for colorless unless you control a swamp, after which they'll tap for one of either of their associated colors. They're a good include for most black decks, but it's kind of a shame that we don't have similar cycles for other colors. I did mention a few other cycles in my full list before of lands that can come in untapped, but this covers the majority, and you can take a look at some of those others here. So all of that is a lot. Of all of those, what are the best? Well, I think I made it clear which I think are always good, which are good depending on your deck, and which of these can probably be skipped. But I'd love to hear some of your opinions in the comments below. But before I wrap up, I know that there's always a discussion about how much land should be in your deck. 30 years ago, we used the benchmark of 1/3 of the deck. But even though power creep is a thing and mana costs have come down, that number has gone up a fair bit. When I first got into Commander, the recommendation was about 36 in a 100 card deck. But now folks have crunched the numbers and 38 is considered a good baseline. The percentage creeps up when we move to standard 60 card decks, with the mid range around 24. And it's often suggested to run even more in limited, 17 in a 40 card deck. All of this boils down to consistency. First, you want a strong start, with typically 3 to 4 lands in your starting hand, and you want to draw a good mix of spells and land over the next several turns to keep up your curve. But that doesn't explain why the percentages are different. And I think the key here is format. In short, smaller decks are for quicker games where you'll see fewer cards overall, and you need to make sure that you see enough lands in that time. Larger decks tend to play longer games, where you'll see more cards, and even where drawing too much land in the late game can slow you down. I'm not a math geek though, so I'm not the best one to explain the nitty-gritty of why these numbers are what they are. Other than that, these are some great suggestions, and they've tended to work for me. Your mileage may vary, of course, depending on your deck strategy, and you should feel free to adjust up or down to suit your needs. I hope I've shared something you found useful in all of this, and go put a few more basics in your deck.